My presentation is about resource-based progression in games. So first I'll talk a bit about general progression systems and then move on to resource-based progression systems, what that means. So first off, a few different types of progression system. The most common and popular in games is probably story-driven, where the progression through the game is largely based on just uncovering the story that the developers laid out for you. So different cutscenes, story items, kind of gives a sense of purpose to the player to uncover the story as they play. A good example of this would be games like The Last of Us, where the story is pretty good, and that's kind of what you play for. Another type would be earned skill progression, so like games where you're trying to level up your character. Skyrim is a good example of this. You're trying to level up different skills, generally gain more power, and just become stronger. And this can encourage grinding in some games, that kind of thing. Another one would be mastering gameplay as the progression. So this would be kind of like PvP games, like League of Legends and esports in general, where although there are like classes sometimes, like in League you have your actual leagues, it's progressing through skill levels is the development in the game. There's also unlock progression systems where you're trying to unlock content as you play. So like Call of Duty is a good example of this, where different attachments and guns, that sort of thing, are locked, and you're trying to unlock them as you play the game, unlocking different areas, skills, weapons, that sort of thing. So when implementing progression systems, there's some factors to consider. Like multiple forms of progression can be included in one game. So you can have like leveling as well as gathering resource-based skills, story. They're not like mutually exclusive, you can have different types of them. They can be measured in different ways, like there could be percentage bars, there could be different levels, a general kind of feeling of progression. You have to also consider, can the player feel like they're progressing? Do they feel like they're getting better at the game? Or is it more like a tracked system, where can they see that they're progressing, like there are points going up or that sort of thing? So resource-based progression, which is what I'm really here to talk about. So resource-based progression is when the player progresses through the game by gathering stuff. So it could be items, it could be blocks like in Minecraft, that sort of thing. How far you've progressed in the game is related to how much you have, not like what level you're on, and that sort of thing. It's not really to be confused with an inventory. So like many games have inventory systems, but I'm talking about games where the motivation is entirely gathering, not where gathering kind of facilitates some other goal like leveling up or that sort of thing. So the motivation is to collect, not just to level up. So there has to be a reason to collect. The resources have to be useful for something. And this can lead to like interesting gameplay mechanics, like with DayZ, where you can lose like all of your progress pretty easily. So my first example is Minecraft. So progressing in Minecraft is gathering stuff. You can place the things you gather, but you have to gather things to progress through the game. It's not story-driven or level-driven, although there are some levels. The goals in Minecraft are kind of artificial, like getting to the end. The real goal is just to gather. So it's a pretty good example of a resource-based progression system. The resources are used for building, which gives the motivation to collect them, but you spend your entire game collecting and then placing what you've collected. It kind of goes beyond an inventory system because you can also place the items. So my next example is DayZ. DayZ, the main goal in DayZ is to survive, but surviving is not really the goal because you can't ever achieve it. So it's like life in that respect, you're not actually trying to survive, you're trying to become well equipped to survive. So how you know you're doing really well in DayZ is when you have a character that has like high level rifles, ghillie suits, all that sort of stuff. So from the spawn, right when you start the game, you're trying to get low level gear, move up to mid level and high level gear. The high level gear is put in dangerous places, which makes it interesting and difficult to try and collect. So the game is entirely about moving towards getting higher level gear and progressing that way. So the resources in that game are guns and that sort of thing. You can also, that also leads to permadeath, which I think there was a good presentation of that last year. That's facilitated because of a resource-based progression system, because your progress in the game is what you have. When you die, you lose what you have, rather than skills or that sort of thing. So that gets quite interesting with multiplayer games, because you can have fights over resources. A good example of this is Eve. For those of you who haven't played Eve, you pretty much just you fight with spaceships in space, and you get bigger and better spaceships to fight with. But the interesting thing about Eve is that the teams, so players work in really large groups together. You can have thousands of players in like one company, I think they're called. I don't play Eve myself now, but I've looked into it a bit. So it's resource-based in that you're trying to gather minerals to get better ships, and the ships themselves are resources. Bigger and better ships mean kind of technical superiority. You get kind of an interesting thing happening with emergent gameplay. Emergent gameplay is when things happen in the game that weren't really intended by the developers, but are facilitated by what the developers put in place. So things like treachery and that sort of stuff, like people kind of getting into other people's teams, rising up to the ranks and stealing their high-level ships and that sort of thing. So they can do that because of resource-based progression, the ability to steal from another group and move it to your group, that sort of thing, are emergent gameplay mechanics. It kind of mimics real war, in that there's a struggle for resources, a struggle for resource-rich territory. I think nullsec is what it's called. It's like a really dangerous area in Eve with lots of minerals and things, and different companies fight over this area for these different areas for control. This can lead to technical superiority as well, in that higher companies with bigger and better ships, I think they're called Titans, these really expensive ships that take a lot of effort to get. Having more Titans gives your company more firepower and technical superiority. This can also encourage teamwork, so you can gain more minerals together, you can have mining ships, you can have ships protecting them, and you can protect each other's stuff as a whole better. These are kind of emergent mechanics as well. They're not entirely set out by the developers, these things kind of just happen. So I think there's a lot of potential for multiplayer games in the future with resource-based progression. I think it's a pretty interesting mechanic, which is why I picked it for my topic. So that's all I have for the moment. If any questions or comments or suggestions, feel free.
What was that definition you gave for emergent gameplay before? I might use that in my essay. It was a good definition.
Yeah, it's just like gameplay mechanics and things that kind of happen but weren't really intended by the developers, but are facilitated by what the developers put in place.
Thanks.
Interesting you chose the example of DayZ. You know, how can you define progression and such with the concept of permadeath? You know, what sort of progression? Interesting to how you define
when you ask somebody like how well they play DayZ, they're likely to tell you how much equipment they have, which I think is kind of the measure of progression in that game. So if you, I mean, you could also measure by how long
they
they're alive.
survive.
Yeah, that's another measure. So there's more than one. It can be measured in multiple ways. But somebody can survive for a month in that game and have nothing. They haven't really made it very far. But if they have, like, you know, a sniper rifle, a ghillie suit, they've got a truck and a full of fuel, that sort of thing, you know they've made it pretty far in their particular life, kind of, you know.
In some games, like Terraria for instance, like everything you can do and everything you're capable of is tied to your resource.
Yes, that's a pretty good
your
example.
actual power level comes entirely from what you have.
Yeah, so that's a pretty good example of a resource-based game as well, yeah.
Okay.
Count strategy games as resource-driven. I have a friend who immediately steals gold on Age of Empires 2.
Yeah, Age of Empires is pretty resource-based as well. I suppose it does come into RTSs because you're gathering in those games so that you can build more military and stuff. And your military could kind of be seen as a resource as well, I suppose. So I suppose your definition can kind of change depending on game. I mean, games like even, I suppose, like Grand Theft Auto and stuff, like you've got guns and ammo and bullets and things, and money to kind of be seen as resources for progression. But in those games, I guess the real progression is winning the game. Is kind of the real goal, not really
Like
to.
in some, like in at least Grand Theft Auto Online, the progression system is definitely resource based because it's all about like what cars can you get, what vehicles do you have, do you have a helicopter?
Yeah.
Interesting. So we've got to go. Well done.
So,